Welcome to video number 3, the early Renaissance artists. And today we are going to take a look at three very interesting and popular artists. Donatello on the left with his David, bronze casting. In the center, Fra Filippo Lippi with his Madonna, Child, and two angels. And on the right-hand side, Masaccio with his Trinity. Now, the Italian sculptor, we're going to start out with looking at Donatello. I think he was one of the greatest influences in Florentine sculpture before Michelangelo, and he was also the greatest sculptor before Michelangelo in Florence. And he was very, very influential to the other artists that were living in the Florentine society around him. And they really looked up to him for information and for how he created his sculptures that he created. So a little background on Donatello is that he was born in Florence, Italy, around 1386. And as a sculptor, he apprenticed early with a well-known sculptor and quickly learned the new Gothic style. Before he was 20, he was receiving commissions for his work. Over his career, he developed a style of lifelike, highly emotional sculptures and a reputation second only to Michelangelo's. Donatello, the early Renaissance Italian sculptor, was born Donato di Niccolo di Bento Bardi in Florence, Italy, sometimes in 1386. His friends and family gave him the nickname of Donatello. In 1403, he apprenticed with Florence metalsmith and sculptor Lorenzo Ghiberti. Now, we just talked about Ghiberti in our last video for creating the bronze doors. So once Donatello was actually apprenticed with Ghiberti, and that was when he was commissioned to create the bronze doors for the baptistry of Florence Cathedral, Santa Maria di Fiori. This obviously he was beating out his rival Filippo Brunelleschi. Donatello assisted Ghiberti in creating all of those beautiful cathedral doors. By 1408, Donatello was back in Florence at the workshops of the cathedral. That year, he completed the life-size marble sculpture of David. The figure follows a Gothic style popular at the time with long, graceful lines and an expressionless face. The work reflects the influences of sculptures of the time. Technically, it is very well executed, but it lacks the emotional style and innovative technique that would mark Donatello's later work. Originally, the sculpture was intended for placement in the cathedral. Instead, however, it was set up in the Palazzo Vecchio, or the town hall, as an inspiring symbol of defiance of authority to Florentines, who were engaged in a struggle with the King of Naples at the time. Now, rapidly maturing in his art, Donatello soon began to develop a style all his own, with figures much more dramatic and emotional. By this time, Donatello was gaining a reputation for creating imposing, larger-than-life figures using innovative techniques and extraordinary skills. His style incorporated the new science of perspective, which allowed the sculptor to create figures that occupied measurable space. Before this time, European sculptors used a flat background upon which figures were placed. Donatello also drew heavily from reality for inspiration in his sculptures, accurately showing suffering, joy, sorrow in his figures' faces and his body positions. This is one of my favorite works of art by Donatello, and it is Mary Magdalene. And most of the time, when somebody sculpts Mary Magdalene, it's in a pietà. It's in a very young, beautiful version of Mary. And what I love about this piece is the rawness of it. This is a wood carving by Donatello. And here, Mary Magdalene is old, she's thin, she looks ill, and the emotion and the struggle that you see within this statue is absolutely completely beautiful. And again, what we're seeing here is Donatello moving to this direction of more dramatic and more emotional as his life continues onward. But looking back, we're going to look again at perhaps Donatello's most landmark work, which is his greatest sculptural works of the early Renaissance. And this was his bronze statue of the David. This work signals the return of the nude sculpture in the round figure. Because it was the first such work like this in over 1,000 years, it was one of the most important works in the history of Western art. Now remember, we talked about the Renaissance being this classical rebirth of this Greek and Roman art. Well, remember, medieval world, they did not create these sculptures in the round. So this was that first sculpture that came out in this beautiful lifelike reality in the round. And so it was a phenomenal work of art to be seen at the time. The work itself was commissioned by Cosimo de' Medici for the Palazzo Medici. We do not know when during the mid-15th century Donatello actually cast the bronze statue. Again, we have reoccurring names, reoccurring faces. We see Cosimo de' Medici again, and this piece went into the actual palace of the Medici, also Rucellai Palace that we studied. David is shown as a triumphal moment within the biblical storyline of his battle with Goliath. According to the account, after David struck Goliath with a stone from his slingshot, he cut off his head with Goliath's sword. Here, on this statue that we just looked at of the David, we see the aftermath of this event as David stands in a contemplative pose with one foot atop his enemy's head. You see his enemy's head down here, and Goliath doesn't look so big, but you see his crown, his helmet, his beard, and his head laying there. And the young David is just standing there very triumphantly. In this picture, David wears nothing but boots and a shepherd's hat with laurel leaves on the top of it. This may also allude to his victory or to his role as a poet and a musician. Before Donatello's work, the David was typically depicted as a king, given his status in the Old Testament. But here, however, we have a very different look of David in the stark change way that he is depicted. Not only is he shown nude, but he's a youth. And remember back to the Middle Ages, nudity was not used in art except for certain moral contexts, such as the depiction of Adam and Eve or the sending of souls off to hell. In the classical world, nudity was often used in a different magic context, such as with figures who were gods, heroes, athletes. So we're really going back to that classical look of the world. Here's a hero, an athlete, who should be treated like a god. So he again is calling back to that heroic nudity of antiquity, since David is depicted at a triumphal point in the Bible narrated. So, as for David's youthfulness, Donatello has gone back to the early life, as we just already said. But could David's victory have been gained without divine intervention? Donatello's work seems to imply that the answer is no. The victory was God's rather than man. There's no way that this innocent little boy could have killed Goliath. So God had to intervene. But this is a classical work of the Renaissance. And it was truly revolutionary for its day, and so much did not get copied right away. The idea of a life-size nude sculpture in the round eventually took some time to sink in, but became an acceptable statue. And one of these works of art that we're going to look at further down is we're going to compare this to Michelangelo's David and how these two Davids truly differ within their appeal. The next artist that we're going to take a look at is Masaccio. And Masaccio, by name, obviously up there at the top, Tommaso di Giovanni di Simone Casalis. Forgive my pronunciation. So now he was from what is now San Giovanni, which is very near Florence. And he's an important Florentine painter of the early Renaissance. And his frescoes were in the Brancacci Chapel of the Church of Santa Maria de Carmine, in Florence, and remained influential throughout the Renaissance. In the span of only 6 years, Masaccio radically transformed Florentine painting. His art eventually helped create many of the major conceptual and stylistic foundations of Western painting. Seldom has such a brief life been so important in the history of art. He did not live very long. In his 26 years of life, and really only 6 years of working time, he left a ton of important works behind. And here at the bottom of the page, we see the actual uh, Santa Maria del Carmine and the Brancacci Chapel in the center. And then on the right, we see a scene from the Brancacci Chapel, which is the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the gardens. So we need to look at Masaccio. And Vasari was believed that Masaccio was this nickname that was loosely translated to mean Big Tom or Clumsy Tom because of his absent-mindedness about worldly affairs, carelessness about his personal appearance, and other heedless, but he was a good-natured behavior. There remains no trace of where, when, or with whom that he actually studied throughout his lifetime. And this is actually critical because many Renaissance artists would copy other Renaissance artists. And because they don't actually know with whom he studied with, it's hard to tell where he gained his skills. Donatello, the founder of the Florentine Renaissance sculptural style, Masaccio studied a lot because he had these realistic sculptures that you could walk up to and draw and study and look at the human form and see how it was sculpted. One of Masaccio's most famous pieces, besides the expulsion of Adam and Eve, is the Trinity, which was a fresco of excuse me, in the Church of Santa Maria Novella. So, as we were looking at the Trinity, this fresco of the Santa Maria Novella Church, in Santa Maria Novella in Florence, Italy, it really presents some important pictorial innovations at the time that embody contemporary concerns and influences. It was painted about 1427, and it was probably Masaccio's last work in Florence. But it represents the Trinity, the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. It's set in this barrel vaulted hall before which kneel two donors. So you can see these on the actual picture itself. You can see these donors. Here we go. We're at one right here and the other right there. Okay. And this was a truly beautiful work of art because the way that Masaccio uses one-point perspective, and he probably learned a little of this from Brunelleschi and Brunelleschi's studies. But if you look at this complete fresco painting by Masaccio, every tiny little line back here is going to go to one point. Not Jesus as you might typically think. Every gesture, every pose, every person is looking at one point, okay? Now, the interesting thing about this piece is that it was created for a specific 5-foot person. And at the time, the average height of a person in Florence was 5 feet tall. And so the eye level, your eye level is meant to hit this 5-foot mark. Okay? And then once you would hit that 5-foot mark, it would be in complete perspective. This is one of the first examples that we really see this type of one-point perspective show up in works of art. Again, showing this background, you've got the patrons, and everyone is referring to this Jesus dying on the cross. But this rational, human-scaled, human-centered, and inspired ancient world of this type of perspective is absolutely stunning. So we see this fresco, and we know that the sense of one-point perspective and how important this is. Our next video is going to pick up where we leave off right here, and we'll